Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. For it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church.
Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites.
Jésus, par ton sang précieux, enlève mon iniquité. Regarde-moi sur les cieux, dis-moi que tu m'as pardonné. J'ai longtemps erré cœur rebelle, mais j'entends ta voix qui m'appelle. Au pied de ta croix maintenant, tout confus, brisé, je me rends. Blanc, blanc, plus blanc que neige, blanc, plus blanc que neige, lavé dans le sang de l'agneau, je serai plus blanc que la neige.
Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. 1 Samuel 15.
Greetings, brothers and sisters. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this seventh edition of God is Not White. We have a very, very, very filled with documentation presentation to share with you today. And so I really encourage you to grab a seat, get coffee, tea, hot chocolate. Hot chocolate might be very appropriate for the content of tonight's presentation. My name is Jafrikayiti. I greet you from Ottawa, Gatineau. This is our weekly program, God is Not White, where I go over some of the material that is part of my book published in 2000 under the title Viv Bondye à Relijyon, in Haitian Creole, translated into English, Praise God, Down with Religion. Of course, it's been 24 years since the publication of the book. There's been quite a lot of scholarship since then, and a lot of world events that would inform our discussions every week. And I hope that you've enjoyed and have found the previous presentations to be useful. So I will go over a set of slides as we usually do, and then bring some conclusions to our discussion and share with you a few references. And so, as I mentioned, this is our seventh episode, and it's a continuation of last week's, where we took a closer look at Paul, this character in the Bible that is quite instrumental for what is happening in Christianity up to the present time. I apologize for our colleagues who are following the program on LinkedIn. We seem I've been given a note here that there are some problems on LinkedIn. If that is the case, go to YouTube, and it's or Facebook, and I believe you can also watch it on X, on Jafrikayiti, and you will not miss anything for the time being. Okay, so tonight's presentation, God is Not White, episode 7, Was Paul a Roman spy? And indeed, last week we saw why our conclusion is that Paul was Christian, but not Jesus. And we took a look at the controversy, the conflicts between Paul as we saw them in the books of Acts, and as discussed by different scholars who have studied the matter. And of course, we will tonight basically conclude this in-depth look at what Paul represents to Christianity by answering this question: was Paul a Roman spy? We will go over many of the passages that we find in the book of Acts because there's much of it that's actually in there. But as we've discussed earlier, what sometimes I find fascinating is how I grew up in a Christian church, but throughout the time that we were doing Bible studies and all of these things, the political context within which this was happening was seldom discussed. This is kind of surprising given, the number of films we would say that, seem to depict what, the Jesus story, the crucifixion, etc. Well, let's go over some of the material, and perhaps many of you will say, no, Jafrikayiti, you're wrong. We studied that and we always knew that. Okay. So we will take a look at Paul's credentials as a Jew, his credentials as a Roman citizen, and when he uses them and in what context and why. We will take an even closer look at the arrestation of Paul and the theories about his death, because indeed there is controversy about how, when, where Paul actually died. And then the last question is, what is the net impact? What is the legacy of Paul on the Jesus movement? Okay, so we will take a first look at the book of Acts in Acts 22, verses 1 to 5. This is Paul making the case to fellow Judeans as to why he is as worthy as the others. Again, like we saw last week, this theme is forever present in the writings that are attributed to Paul. This complex of inferiority, this necessity to boast, this necessity to establish his credibility, not in front of foreigners, but in front of the very people to whom he claims to belong. And we have to ask why that is. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them for their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. Again, you will notice here that he refers to this group of followers of Jesus not as Christians, because that term was not yet in use, as we discussed earlier. It's a term that came hundreds of years after the death of Jesus. They were talking about this way. Okay, so it was one of the ways, the many ways within the Judean sects that existed in occupied Palestine at the time. And so Paul is making the case that he has been a promoter of the various conservative definitions of Judaism. Well, not Judaism, I don't know if you call it, yes, yeah, Judaism at the time, because by then they had many different sects of Judaism, but he was saying that, yes, I am one of you. And in fact, those people who are talking about something that is slightly different than, mainstream Judaism, I used to persecute them. That's how he's making the case that he is one of them. Okay. But he's not casting the way as being something else. You will see that also as we proceed. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him. He is not fit to live. Acts 22, verses 17 to 22. Now, what is happening here? Paul is arguing with his fellow Jews that he is one of them, but he's saying that the reason that he is credible is not because he walked with Jesus, because he did not. He wasn't there. The whole time that Jesus was alive, he was part of the Roman army persecuting the followers of Jesus, Jesus and his followers. But his credibility rests on the fact that he claims that while he was engaged in this action of persecution, some miracle happened on the road to Damascus, and he's explaining it. And he's also explaining how he participated in the stoning of Stephen. For those who are more familiar with the French or Creole, the term here is Etienne. Etienne is the Stephen in English. Okay, but listen to the same person who's making the case that he's a Jew among the Jews. What does he do when now he gets in trouble with the Romans? As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. And this stretched him out to flog him. And they stretched him out to flog him. Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Now, I find this passage quite fascinating. Would this suggest that then they never put Roman citizens in chains? I don't know. Anyways, again, this is in the Bible. Okay. What's important though to note here is with the same speed that Paul defends his Jewish identity, when in trouble with the Romans, he also defends his Roman citizen identity. Let's go back again to his efforts to defend himself as a Jew, because now the Romans, trying to figure out what to do with this man, decided to send him to make his case in front of the Jewish leadership, religious leadership. So now what we need to understand is the political context. Occupied Palestine, when the Roman Empire took over all of northern Africa and parts of, large parts of Europe. Okay, so we're not talking about the city of Rome here. We're talking about the Roman Empire. Okay, and so in order to control those territories that the Roman Empire took over, they established puppet leaders. Puppet leaders at the political level, like Herodes or Herod, and puppet leaders at the religious, the high priest. So there are rules as to who should become the king of the Jews at the political level. You should be a descendant of David, and as a high priest, you need to be a descendant of Levi. And we saw how they give genealogies of Jesus to to make sure that he meets both criteria, so that he could be the political leader and the religious leader of the Jews. Okay, and they argue that the folks who write the Bible argue that both from his mother's side and from Joseph's side. I don't know why, since they argued that Joseph has nothing to do with him. But in any case, so Paul is now in front of the leaders of the Jews, and some very surprising things in this quote. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest. For it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees, and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the people of the resurrection of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." Acts 23, verses 1 to 6. Now, how could Paul, who is a Pharisee, like he says, not realize that Ananias was the high priest? And he is in front of them to be judged. Like the guy is seated on the big chair, for crying out loud. And on top of that, Paul has been, you know, a an active persecutor of Jews. So he must have been familiar with the temple and those people. In any case, this is his defense there. And then what happens? It gets even weirder. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Well, Paul knew what he was doing, right? The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits. But the Pharisees believe all these things. This is why he said that. So he knew that by using this strategy, he was going to divide them. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him to the barracks. Now, what's interesting here is to note how all of these people who were considered Jews, who worship in the same temple, had the high priest that they respected the same, did not all believe in the same things. Okay, so some of them believed that spirits existed and they could speak to folks, and some believe that after you die you could resurrect, and others not. Okay, so again, this idea that sometimes we think that there's just a single set of beliefs that folks had, you know, uh, even from Judaism and then to Christianity. That's not how it was. There's been always been a plurality of superstitious beliefs that people had around the time, and this is also what we see in the book of Acts. But look what happened. First of all, we were told earlier, right, that the commander panicked just because they had put a Roman citizen in chains. I find that very strange. If Paul was just a Roman citizen, I don't see why arresting him and putting him in chains would have been such a terrifying thing. Uh, Throughout this story, it seems that there is intervention after intervention to protect Paul, and his protection comes not from his fellow Jews, but from the Roman occupying forces. Okay? Take him away from them by force. So they mobilize the forces of the military force to protect Paul from supposedly his own people. Why? Why do they care so much about Paul? Well, listen to what happened. Paul, a Jew in an occupied territory of the Romans. The Romans are extremely cautious about this guy. Look what happened. Then he called two of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen." That's how many people? Eh? That's 470 to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Well, even if you say that the 200 soldiers are using 70, well, no, that's different people. Provide horses for Paul. Of course, he's not going to walk, even if they didn't care about him. But here it sounds like they're talking about, someone who is precious. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. Acts 23, verse 23, 24. But before we get to Acts 23 like that, we need to understand what happened. Well, he was in jail. Why are they taking him to another place, to Governor Felix? Well, listen to what happened. If you take a look at Acts 23, verses 16 to 22, you get this amazing story. But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, okay, so he heard of a plot to kill Paul, he went into the barracks and told Paul. So Paul had access to his family to come and visit him. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." That doesn't sound like, a scared Jew who is arrested by the Romans in occupied territory. Paul is acting with a lot of confidence. Haitians would say, "Gren namunda." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him." You remember he was there, so they're asking for him back again. And don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request. The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." Now, why do they care so much about Paul in terms of protecting him from his own people who are angry at him, and, to mobilize 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to take him to Caesarea at night, providing horses for Paul? Why? Well, let's take a look at a map. To take Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea, it takes a cavalry. Okay, it's not a small distance. So the soldiers carrying out their orders took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. See, halfway there, almost, basically. Okay, from mainland there inside to Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him. Okay, that's still a whole lot of soldiers with this one prisoner. While they return to the barracks, so the others, a number of them return, and then the cavalry goes on with Paul. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter. Yeah, there's a letter. You can check that out. It's actually well described in the Bible, in the book of Acts, to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Okay? Why a lowly Jew in an occupied territory is being treated with such deference? He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. I mean, in many countries of the world, we would be very jealous of Paul today. It's like, yeah, let them harass me and take care of me in this place, man. I'd be in Herod's palace. I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews. So you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you will go. Again, why? Why not just, if you think that this guy, you cannot find anything wrong with him, just release him. Let the Jews deal with him. It's not your problem. He asked to see Caesar himself, and he gets it. He gets exactly what he wanted. But before he was taken to Caesar, King Agrippa came along, and Festus wanted to do another try to see if Agrippa, who is also a Jew, one of those puppet Jews that are established by the Roman occupying force, to see, what happens if he was to question Paul. Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man? The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found that he had done nothing deserving of death. But because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to His Majesty about him, and no kidding. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. Again, and Paul is eventually taken to Rome, and it's a very, very treacherous trip by boat. All kinds of things happen during the trip. But here is what we read. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away by escaping. Okay, this is during the trip to Rome, and they had all kinds of problems on, shipwreck on an island. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life, mes amis. Like, why? Of all the other people, there were many prisoners there, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. Who paid? Where does the salary of Paul come from? He stayed there for 2 whole years in his own rented house. Look what we read in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 14 and 15. And this is Paul speaking. In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me, for I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. So, who paid for the rent? Well, for 2 whole years, Paul stayed in Rome because he asked to see Caesar. Of course, we are told that Paul was a martyr like all the other ones, but in reality, no one knows how Paul died. This is from Britannica. The exact details of St. Paul's death are unknown, but tradition holds that he was beheaded in Rome and thus died as a martyr for his faith. His death was perhaps part of the executions of Christians ordered by the Roman Emperor Nero following the Great Fire in the city in 64 Common Era. It is known that St. Paul was imprisoned in Rome and wrote several of his epistles or letters during his captivity there. Indeed, there are places where he's saying that he is held captive. But there is no confirmation of when Paul died. Now, is there confirmation that a human being named Paul ever existed? I don't know if you can call it confirmation, but many of the early church historians refer to Paul, and there are books that were not retained by the church leaders to be part of the Bible, including an Acts of Paul that talks also about Paul. Why did they not retain those books? What do these books say? Again, a lot of questions. But what was the net impact of Paul? What's his legacy on the Jesus movement? This man never walked with Jesus. In fact, the whole time he was fighting those guys, those men and women, I must say, and he comes preaching something that is quite different than what the brother of Jesus, James in particular, was preaching, because throughout his time, Paul was taking those Jews as far away from Judaism as they knew it as possible. And you will see the core message of Paul is obedience to established authorities. That's why the reasonable conclusion that many have reached is that Paul was a spy, hired by the Romans to continue doing exactly what he was doing, to undo any movement of the Jews in the occupied territories. And when I use the term Jews here, it is not an equivalent of the people they call Jews today. It's the people who lived in that area and who practice Judaism. These people had multiple different faiths and beliefs, but what they had in common is that they were the people of that land, the land that was occupied by the invading Romans. And the Romans didn't want any of them to be, you know, revolutionary, fighting the established authority, especially when they had established de facto leadership that the people naturally would reject. And so, what was Paul teaching after he took over the Jesus movement was in fighting open fights that you see in the book of Acts with the brother of Jesus. Because, of course, James would be the natural leader of the church. It was the guy's brother who was killed. Well, if you read what they kept in the Bible, you'd get a sense that Jesus did not care for his family because he said, "My brothers, my mother, my sisters are those who follow the words of God and not, right?" Who put those things in the Bible after Jesus was killed? Was Jesus there when they were putting words in his mouth? He was dead. And so, Paul, whose words dominate modern day Christianity, says, "I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preach is not of human origin." Again, he's still trying to justify himself. "I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ." Yeah, he showed up in the heavens, and some people heard, some saw, you know, Galatians 1, verses 11. Would we, in this day and age, believe someone who would come and tell us what Paul told folks at his time? Would you believe if someone said that he wants to take over the leadership of, um, I guess, the Democratic Party in the US when his whole life he was an extreme right-wing Republican? Like, let's say, what's the name of this guy? The guy who had the helmet on January 6th, storming the Capitol in Washington, where they killed 5 of the guards. Viking man. Let's say Viking man now would show up and say, "I want to take the leadership of the Democratic Party." How many people would say, "Oh yeah, sure. You were on the road to Damascus and you saw JFK. Definitely, you should lead us." I don't think anybody would take him seriously. But Paul did more than that. He was part of the stoning of Stephen and many others for the Romans, the occupying forces. Paul says, trying to explain where he takes his authority from, "Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 years. I saw none of the other apostles." Okay, so he's basically saying that it's not them who taught me, because I got what I got from Jesus himself directly. "Only James, the Lord's brother." Okay, so again, now Paul confirming that Jesus had a brother. Yeah, I know the Catholic Church says that Mary was a virgin and remained a virgin even after having a whole bunch of children, but that's for people who are really asleep. Paul continues, I assure you before God that what I am writing you is no lie. Of course, he has to continuously justify himself, say that he's not lying, because what he is saying is not believable. So then, why do people believe it now? Well, it's indoctrination. You are told how to read all of this, how to understand all of this. The net impact of Paul's legacy, or his net impact on the Jesus movement, is in Titus 3, verse 1. Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good. Now, this would be a bargain for the Romans. An obedient people who rely on rulers and authorities established for them, over them by Rome. As I urge you when I went to Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies, the study of genealogies, that is, who was the father of who. Of course, if you are competing with the brother, the sister, the mother of Jesus, you would be telling folks, forget about genealogies. I am telling you what you need to believe. Don't listen to James. Don't listen to Mary Magdalene. Don't listen to the mother of Jesus. These people have no importance, no more than I, because I was on the road to Damascus and I saw Jesus from heaven. And I'm preaching something to you that no one else is preaching, and you need to listen to me. Then after 3 years, see, and again, you need to understand what Paul says, that when he spoke to the Lord, he knew that he couldn't go back to the city where he was killing people. And he says that God or Jesus told him to go to Europe. Okay? And that's where he went. Okay? I went to Macedonia. Okay? And then it's afterwards that he returned with his story and everything, right? But now he has established himself from these other communities, and therefore he's now returning. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing to you is no lie. His net impact: there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Of course, Paul's mission is to take the superstition of the people of Judea, make it palatable to non-Jews, mixing all kinds of things, right? Forget about circumcision. You can see all kinds of things that he's written saying, these people are no better than those who are not circumcised. Don't forget about that. Yeah, you can eat whatever you want, because the Romans want peace. They want everybody to be Roman citizens under the subject of Rome. And so Paul is doing the work for them. And he's promising them, heaven. And that's why Christianity became such a useful tool for other people who are being subjugated. And so Paul took Christianity, well, not Christianity, the Jesus movement, okay, into Europe, and Europe created Christianity. Because then that thing that was coming back with Paul and that was to be embellished later on, when Rome had full control on the thing, and we will see more about that in terms of who was deciding what is and what isn't word of God, then it became such an easier tool to use to subjugate people than what Jesus was doing when he entered the temple uh, um, in John 2, verse 15, and chased out the thieves from the temple. That's not what Paul was doing. Paul was with the people ruling, not fighting them like Jesus was doing in the temple. Yes, the net impact of Paul's preaching or on the Jesus movement can be found in Colossians 3, verses 22, Ephesians 6, verses 5 to 9, 1 Timothy 6, 1 Peter 2, 18, Titus 2, verse 9. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. What a gift. And the Europeans took it and they ran with it. And today, it's not the Europeans who are preaching it, it is their victims. In Africa, in Haiti, where I was born and raised, in Asia, in Latin America, you are to learn to be obedient to establish authority. And so, a few references, of course. I encourage people to read their Bible and to take a look at a map while they're doing it and, get a sense of what the size of Rome was, the distances when they say people were traveling. Why would the Roman authorities pay so much attention to a Jewish prisoner like Paul, mobilizing hundreds of soldiers to escort a man because he said, I want to, you know, argue my case in front of Caesar himself. And that is after the Romans saved him from being killed by his own people. James, the brother of Jesus, the key to unlocking the secrets of early Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls, Christianity Betrayed, the Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, the Bible and Christianity, the African Origin of Civilization, Myth and Reality, or Reality, Chegan Diop, and Viv Bondye about Relijyon. You can go on my website. There you will find many other references. Next week, we ask, whose fingerprints do you see on the Bible? Are these the words of men, like every other book that exists, that has ever existed? Or is this book magical? Somehow, the words from this book do not come from human beings. We will analyze that with no fear. And so, I have many comments here. Paul lived decades after Caesar was killed. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, so they claim that it was under Nero that Paul was killed, but this is speculation. No one knows that for sure. Paul's life reads like the life of a spy. The man's work does a lot of good to Rome. It's like the KKK changing sides. Do you think that the Polish and German soldiers who switched sides were Polians? I don't know, as we say in Haitian culture. I don't live in this neighborhood. Ronald, ou pa di aye frère, sauve frère. Jésus sauve. Yes, there is plenty to be learned um, from these things. Okay, no. Marie Nadine Pierre, it's not Julius Caesar, okay? Caesar is a title. So it's whoever was the Caesar at the time. And of course, it wasn't Julius Caesar at the time of Paul. And so it's whoever the Caesar is in Rome at the time. And I believe they give the name, but I can't remember it right now. So Paul saw all of the intermediaries, and then they simply tell you that he was living in his own place in Caesar, in Rome, but never explain what happened there. It's like the story simply doesn't conclude, and like I said, it's other people who claim their speculation is that Paul died during the fire with Nero. But again, there is a necessity for the folks in Rome who took over the superstitious belief to make of Paul a hero, right? So placing him with those who were killed by Nero gives them status like all the others who were killed, right? But there's no proof that he actually was killed. Okay, and so it's kind of like a contradiction within Christianity that this man who everything that is verifiable is that he persecuted the followers of Jesus. That's verifiable. He admits it, he addresses it in his own writings. But the other things that are being said about him are written years even after that he himself is gone. And that's why, in terms of authorship of the Gospels, you will see that there's the book of Hebrews, which is, you would say, well, okay, it's the letter to the Hebrews, the letter to the Romans, and all of them were written by Paul. But no, the scholars are saying they don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. And if you take a look at the book itself, how it's written, you will see the difference. It's not the same style, and it's not the same subject. In all of the other letters of Paul, he is basically establishing how people should live their lives and why you should listen to him and not the others. The others don't know what they're saying. He is the one who knows, and he knows because he saw Jesus in a dream, in a vision, while he was going to kill some more of his followers. And that, you should believe him. So this is all I had to share with you this week, brothers and sisters. I bid you farewell and see you next week for another episode of God is Not White.
Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. For it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church.
Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites.
Jésus, par ton sang précieux, enlève mon iniquité. Regarde-moi sur les cieux, dis-moi que tu m'as pardonné. J'ai longtemps erré cœur rebelle, mais j'entends ta voix qui m'appelle. Au pied de ta croix maintenant, tout confus, brisé, je me rends. Blanc, blanc, plus blanc que neige, blanc, plus blanc que neige, lavé dans le sang de l'agneau, je serai plus blanc que la neige.
Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. 1 Samuel 15.